Thank you very much, David, for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's so exciting. I'm going to speak a little bit about a more conceptual issue. I hope that my contribution will also be relevant for the work you're doing. Another thing, I would like to applaud you for the courage and trying to bring together all these different lines of thinking. Also because it might be quite controversial in some communities. So I'm really... Very good. But I go here with Victor Hugo, who said, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I think we might be here witnessing a time that has come, so, or the right time. So let me take you back a little bit to about 25 years ago, when some of these ideas were already kind of formulated by Ladislav Kovač, who actually drew from ideas of evolutionary epistemology more than 30 years before that. And Pamela Leon has mentioned Ladislav, so he's one of the forerunners of basal cognition. And he argued then that cognition and knowledge are biogenic phenomena that have been selected for by evolution. And as such, they are, of course, subjects to natural selection, meaning that here we've got the clear moving away from the idea that humans have this privileged position, but going in the direction that there is a continuity of cognition and knowledge, as we have been talking about when we talked about less complex organisms. However, there is also a caveat I want to mention, and that caveat comes from the perception how evolution is very often represented in many textbooks, and how the general perception of evolution is that still ties back to the standard theory of evolution based on the modern synthesis. However, there has been a lot of changes in evolutionary theory since, and these should also be taken in consideration, which I know that many of you already do. But this is something you have to keep in mind, because we have to look at other processes than just simple natural selection. So this continuity idea, we have to be careful. The caveat I'm saying is that there is no tree of life, as you probably know. And this tree of life, this idea of tree of life, is actually based on a religious, a theological concept, the great chain of being, the scala naturae, where you have this hierarchical process from the very simple organisms to the more higher organisms, which are ending up in somewhere God or something. And that's not how sequencing data tell us that we don't have a tree of life. We have more something like a bush of life with many more ramifications, or maybe, as Darwin already depicted it, as something like a coral of life. So, and that tells us also a little bit of why something as unfortunate like the triunine brain could have still survived, because this idea of hierarchically adding one thing after the other, anatomically, for example, that this is still somehow in our minds. We need some sort of paradigm shift here. So going away from this modern synthesis idea of evolutionary theory to an extended evolutionary theory that includes other processes, like convergent evolution. Eric mentioned that in his question to Marta today. So that's one thing. Or developmental processes, evo-devo processes, and niche construction. I'm going to say a little bit more about the two, but especially evo-devo and niche construction, but also convergent evolution. Just let me say one sentence, that for many, many decades, it was considered intelligence had much to do with the six-layered architecture of the cortex, the mammalian cortex. And this is why birds were completely overlooked, because the nuclei did not fit this narrative. Now, with convergent evolution, we see that different morphologies, different architectures still give us behavioral similarities. Right? Now, going to evo-devo processes, I want to show you that this neglection of developmental processes, that this was also a big mistake that now we have to reintegrate. So, and here I'm using some examples from human evolution, from our hominin lineage. And as you all know, that there has been a drastic increase in brain size over the last 3 million years. So a threefold increase from our common ancestors we had together with Australopithecus to the modern humans, from 500 grams to about 1.3, 1.4 even kilograms. And this was probably due to different genes that were involved. Also, as we know from many experiments, also as anthropologists have shown, probably due to changes in tool use, for example, in group size and so on, but also in developmental processes. And this is an example I would like to give you using the SRGAP2 gene. And this SRGAP2 gene is an interesting candidate that seems to be involved in brain expansion or in the expansion of the cortex, and that underwent duplication. So we share, humans share this gene with other mammals, but over the last 3 million of years, there was gene duplication, several gene duplications in humans. And these gene duplications are very interesting because they had a very unusual effect. And that I use that as an example to show you that we don't have this one-to-one mapping of a gene, and then that all of a sudden completely changes the function. You have a different function, but the function here that is changed is actually a timing or a developmental speed process. So what this SRGAP2 gene is doing is it's a small GTPase activating protein, and is involved in brain maturation, in synaptic development, differentiation, and so on. And the duplication of this gene was an incomplete duplication, and the wild type gene, let's call it, this is the SRGAP2A gene, that's how it's called in the literature, was incompletely duplicated, and this incomplete duplication has been shown that it oligomerized with the wild type and had a dominant negative effect. Now, that itself is not yet surprising, or not that, but the effect then was really startling, because rather than having now a changed function, it led to a heterochronic effect. That means a shift in the development. And that was shown to have the following effect. So if you use as a model organism rodents, a mouse, here this is pyramidal cells from mice, and you look at the maturation of the dendritic spines, then usually in the maturation of the mouse brain, at the postnatal day 21, these spines are fully matured. Now, if you co-express this truncated fragment that associates with the wild type, it leads to a very interesting phenotype. You have a different morphology of these spines, and until postnatal day 21, you still have these filopodia-like structures. That doesn't mean that there is a defect, it's just a change in the timing. When you let them mature for longer time, then they become these knob-like structures again. So, and that's interesting because this is, of course, exactly the time when all these exuberant growth and trimming of the synapses happen. So this shift of timing, this developmental change, gave natural selection a different handle. It allowed the variation to take place during development. So this is a very different way from this gene-centric view of it means that the variation comes from, of course, involvement by the gene, but it actually comes from a shift in the developmental speed. So that's one process, and the other process I want to say a few words about is niche construction. And niche construction you're probably also familiar with, that has been kind of largely ignored for a long time, although it was already pointed out, maybe not in that way, but by Charles Darwin himself. So niche construction is very different from this idea of the modern synthesis. So when we look at the standard depiction of how natural selection works, you have a very passive organism, an organism that transmits its genome to its offspring, and it suffers the pressure from the environment. And that's the natural selection kind of pushes, then changes the allele frequencies in the population, and only those that were successful then transmit the genes to the next generation. Now, in niche construction, you have a very different way of looking, a different perspective of looking at the role of organism. It makes the organism an active agent. So, and what does the organism do here is it influences the environment itself. And by changing the environment, it actually allows a better adaptation to the environment. And as I said, Charles Darwin used the example of earthworms to change the environment, making itself better adapted. You can think of beavers, but you can also think, of course, of bacteria excreting substances or plants, so to make themselves more adaptive. And the interesting thing is, here you do not only have the process, this reciprocal process that includes natural, the organism to influence natural selection itself. So a lot of wonderful work is done by Kevin Leyland and his colleagues. But it also, and that is what I want to point out, and this is where the epigenetic comes in, is you also transmit the environment to your offspring. So you, an earthworm, the offspring of the earthworm will live in a different environment because of its parent. And this transmission allows to be adapted to different niches. And of course, that makes sense for humans, especially because we are the paradigmatic niche constructors. But it goes for any kind of organisms. Let me just, before we shift to a slightly different topic, let me just conclude with this example of niche construction that has to do with stress. And this is an important finding because, again, this can be applied to many, many different organisms. And I've looked at that and published last year a book about the effect of stress on brain development, but especially in children. But here I would like to draw from experiments, beautiful experiments from Regina Sullivan's group about the stress in young rodents and what effect that had on brain development, because we know from humans that brain development under stress is can be impaired in some areas, for example, in the hippocampal areas. But what you can, of course, not do, you can only do correlations, but you can never find causal links, what stress is doing in which brain areas and what behavioral effect that has. So Regina Sullivan's group has disentangled this information by using rodent models and exposed the offspring to stress. And thereby they could disentangle that stress, a high stress level, effects on the level of cortisol and ACTH and so on, had an effect on the hippocampus size and on cognitive impairment, as we knew. So that was not surprising. But what they could then causally show is if the stress was exerted by the mother animal, then this caused a premature development or earlier maturation of the amygdala. And that caused a negative effect in the social behavior. And this kind of negative social behavior is then transmitted because these young animals become parents themselves and they transmit that behavior. So we have here a social niche construction that gets transmitted. So this was just to give you a little bit of an idea of these processes that are equally important for evolutionary evolution that have been very often neglected in the literature because, they were never as prominent and it's much more difficult to get studied. So let me shift gear and let me talk a little bit about knowledge. Knowledge, as I understand it, as a product of cognition. And here I would like to go with Brian Goodwin, who was a very famous developmental biologist. And he says, a basic attribution of living organisms is their possession and utilization of knowledge about aspects of the world. Knowledge which renders them competent to survive, reproduce, and evolve in an environment they know. And with this definition, this is so general, then of course it applies to all organisms we have been talking about. And I'm very happy about this definition because this gives this integrates many schools of thoughts that have already come up with this idea, but they're not put together like David luckily made this important move to bring all these strengths of thoughts together. So here this was already the first attempt that we have life in any form of organisms already as a knowledge-gaining process, or as Karl Popper already said in the last century, in the beginning of the 80s, he said, from Amöbe to Einstein, the growth of knowledge is always the same. Right, so this would, of course, fit very nicely to all the sorts of basal cognition we've heard. So, importantly, we have knowledge here as useful descriptions about some aspects of the world. Descriptions, or maybe representations, or maybe states. I don't know. So we have to be precise, of course, in the formulation. But this is again, this is also something work in progress, and this is something I'm taking from Ladislav Kovács's ideas about cognitive biology. So if we have these different states or different descriptions, then we're well aware that we have different possibilities to express them numerically, for example, as probabilities, which of course links us then back to what we've heard already yesterday and today about, so these probabilities assign likelihood about what we know that could happen, or what an organism knows that it could happen, and how it could respond to cues in the environment. And we've heard a lot about problem solving and decision making over the last day and today, and that would always lead to a reduction in uncertainty. So where you can see the link already to what we've talked about information and in the Shannon sense. Now, importantly, these probabilities depend on what we know, and if new information is acquired, then this modifies the probability. So that's clearly a Bayesian kind of iterative process where you have the probabilities that depend on the available information, and the information is a function of the probabilities. So here with this kind of circular or iterative process, you can already see that this gives you a handle or an idea how accumulation of knowledge could have happened. And this is where I like to connect it to the evolutionary process. So you have an incremental process of changing probabilities of existing beliefs in the light of new evidence. And this leads us to an accumulation of knowledge over, this can be in an ontogenetic way of looking at it, or also, and this is where Ladislav Kovács is going with his hypothesis, in an evolutionary perspective. So we have evolution as a driver of the growth of knowledge, or what he calls epistemology. And here, evolution is not only the evolution of cognition as a cumulative process, but it also has the form of a ratchet. And what does this mean? So this is the idea. This actually goes back to Richard Feynman, where you have the increment means you don't fall back to a zero level, but you build on existing beliefs, which you update. So it's this wretched idea that let me go back, where you kind of have a base level that needs to be updated or can be updated, and that allows you to accumulate or put layers on top. Now, if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, then this, I would like to phrase that with the words of Ladislav Kovac, that he says that overall the construction of the organism, the embodiment of the achieved knowledge, represents an epistemic complexity, so a complexity of knowledge that is built in the morphology and the architecture of the organism. So, and this can continually increase in biological evolution. I added the cultural evolution. So here you have embodied cognition as this cumulative process. Now, this brings us again back to information theory and Shannon's definition of information. And if we add a scaling factor here, that is something that is done, for example, for this in binary systems, computer system, where in decision trees, where each step kind of this each step gives you a node where you can then decide 0, 1. If we kind of translate that to evolutionary trajectories, then you have an accumulation of knowledge that gives you the steps from the past that allow you to reach the present state of knowledge. So in this sense, knowledge is embodied in a system, and that corresponds to a complexity, an epistemic complexity, a complexity of knowledge. So the evolutionary past provides this total set of potential actions for the future. And let me conclude with the last, I think, 2 slides. 1 minute, 1 slide. So if we look at this circular process of knowledge accumulation, then if we take into consideration that besides, as humans, besides the biological evolution, cultural evolution has become so very dominant, then you see that there is a highly accelerating factor here that has to do with the growth of knowledge and gives us a snowballing effect. And this shift from the biological evolution to the cultural evolution has led to an exponential accumulation of knowledge. And that is due to cultural evolution being much faster. So we can show that with medical interventions, as some of my colleagues have shown. And of course, also because of inclusive inheritance like niche construction, where you have a different set of environment that enables you to make, for example, to use memories in a different way, exosomatic, where you can reduce your metabolic costs and the cognitive load and explore different cognitive niches. And last but not least, then also, and this is something for the future, how this interaction of new knowledge, like discoveries, they do not just linearly build on each other, but now for the first time in history, they have become have gained a dynamic that they can mutually interact and scaffold each other. And that might lead to an even stronger explosion, as some of the people like Ray Kurzweil, for example, would argue. So, yeah, with that, I would like to thank you very much. I hope I did not take too long. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions at most. Oh, there. Let me take that.
how does the idea of knowledge accumulating over evolution square with the fact that the environment that a species lives in is constantly changing?
Thank you very much. A very good question. This is exactly one of the things that has been probably overlooked for a long time when we just had a very gene-centric view. Actually, most of the genome contains a lot of information or a lot of data, I should say. Information only becomes then when it's being interpreted by the organism, that is only used under circumstances that might not be immediately encountered. So for a long period of time, organisms might only live in a certain environment, and there the standard use of its genes might be sufficient. However, there is a lot of Darwin's hidden ink. So there is a lot of ways how to express genes under circumstances that are very unusual. For example, you can increase the rate of mutation, or you can also, under stress situation, activate other genes. So in this sense, you would have a bigger repertoire then. I hope that answered your question a bit.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the... Thank you again.
Thank you.